The soft drizzle of a spring afternoon blurred the glass walls of the oncology wing at St. Mary's Medical Center in Seattle. Ethan Cole, a worn-out auto mechanic and single father, sat alone beneath the pale hospital lights, waiting for a diagnosis that could end everything. 3 years ago, cancer had taken his wife. Now he feared it might take him too, leaving his 7-year-old daughter alone in the world. Across the waiting room, a woman in a tailored gray suit pressed a trembling hand against her phone. Then Ethan heard her whisper urgently, *, please, just pretend to be my husband. Just for today. Neither of them knew that moment would change both their lives. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and cold coffee. Ethan Cole had been sitting in the same plastic chair for 47 minutes. He knew the exact count because he'd checked the clock on the far wall every time the second hand swept past the 12. A habit he'd developed in the first weeks after Claire died, when time had stopped meaning anything except the distance between one terrible moment and the next. He was 36 years old. He had grease permanently embedded under 2 of his fingernails despite the scrubbing he'd done in the men's room downstairs. He was wearing his cleanest flannel shirt, the dark blue one that Mia had helped him button that morning, standing on her tiptoes, her small face very serious with concentration. You look handsome, Daddy, she'd said. He hadn't been able to answer her right away. St. Mary's Oncology Wing occupied the 4th floor of the East Tower. The waiting area was a long rectangle with floor-to-ceiling windows along one side, and the condensation from the morning's rain still clung to the glass in long, crooked trails. Seattle in April was rarely anything but gray, and today was no exception. The Space Needle was barely visible through the low clouds, just the faint suggestion of its shape against a sky the color of old pewter. Ethan had driven himself here. He hadn't told anyone, not his neighbor Linda, who watched Mia on school days, not his brother in Portland, not his buddy Ray from the shop. He hadn't wanted to have the conversation where someone said times it's probably nothing and he'd have to nod and pretend to believe it. He knew too much about what times it could be. He'd spent 3 years learning the vocabulary of oncology in the worst possible classroom. The biopsy had been 11 days ago. His GP, a careful and kind man named Dr. Whitfield, had referred him after a routine blood panel showed elevated liver enzymes. The ultrasound had found a shadow. The shadow required investigation. The investigation had led here. Ethan turned the paper cup of coffee in his hands without drinking it. On the chair beside him, his phone screen glowed with a photo of Mia, taken at her last birthday. She was holding a cupcake with both hands, frosting on her nose, laughing at something just outside the frame. He'd set it as his wallpaper 2 weeks ago and hadn't been able to change it since. She needs you, he thought. The same thought he'd been cycling through since 3 in the morning when he'd given up on sleep. She needs you to not be sick. She needs you to be here. That was when he first noticed the woman across the room. She'd been there when he arrived, sitting with the perfect upright posture of someone who had spent years training themselves not to show weakness. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back and a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Ethan made in a month. A leather portfolio sat on the empty chair beside her. Her shoes were the kind with thin heels that clicked decisively on marble floors. Though she was very still now, both hands wrapped around her own paper cup. It was the hands that caught his attention. They were shaking. Not dramatically, she had them pressed close to the cup, trying to contain it, but the tremor was visible from 10 feet away, and her eyes, when she wasn't consciously composing her expression, held a particular kind of fear that Ethan recognized immediately because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. It was the fear of someone waiting for a verdict. She caught him looking. Her chin lifted slightly, a reflex, the automatic reassembly of composure, and for a moment they simply regarded each other across the impersonal expanse of gray carpet and plastic furniture. Then her name was called by a nurse in blue scrubs, Victoria Hale. She rose with the fluid, practiced motion of someone accustomed to entering rooms and owning them. But Ethan caught the barely perceptible hesitation before she followed the nurse through the door, and he understood it precisely, because he felt the same thing every time a doctor's door swung open. Asterisk. Whatever is waiting behind that door, asterisk, he thought. Asterisk, it's going to change something. Asterisk. He turned back to the clock. 53 minutes now. The second hand swept past the 12 again. She was back in 11 minutes. Ethan noticed because he was still watching the clock. The door to the consultation corridor swung open, and Victoria Hale walked out with a different quality of stillness than she'd had before. Not composed, but frozen. There is a difference. Composed people have chosen their expression. Frozen people have simply stopped being able to choose anything at all. She was 3 steps into the waiting room when the elevator doors opened. The woman who emerged was perhaps 10 years older than Victoria, dressed in a sharp navy blazer with a silk blouse beneath it, her silver-streaked hair cut in a precise bob. She had the manner of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in a room unhurried, observant, with a small, satisfied smile already forming as she recognized Victoria. Ethan watched the color change in Victoria's face. It was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of reaction that happens before the mind has time to intervene. Victoria. The woman's voice carried the particular warmth of someone who is not warm at all. What a surprise. Margaret. Victoria's own voice was steady, which Ethan thought was a remarkable feat given the circumstances. Margaret Lawson, Ethan would learn the name later, let her gaze travel with deliberate casualness around the oncology wing, taking in the signage, the pamphlet rack near the nurses' station, the framed information posters about treatment options. She allowed the survey to be noticed. That was the point of it. Routine checkup? Margaret said. Something like that. Victoria had moved slightly, as though rearranging herself, but there was nowhere to go. The waiting room was not large. You? Visiting a friend on the 3rd floor. I took the wrong elevator. Margaret smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes. You look pale. Victoria. Are you sleeping? I sleep fine. The Harrington proposal has everyone on edge, I'm sure. Margaret tilted her head. 3 days away. You must be under enormous pressure. A brief pause, perfectly calculated. I do hope you're feeling well enough to see it through. There it was. Not a question. An assessment of a potential weakness. Ethan had never seen a corporate power struggle play out in an oncology waiting room before, but he recognized predation in most of its forms, and what he was watching was predatory. Victoria's hands were clasped in front of her now, very controlled, but the tendons at her wrists were visible. This was the moment she looked at him. It was only a second, less than a second, but it was direct and desperate and asking something that she didn't have time to articulate. Her eyes moved from him to Margaret and back to him again, and the calculation in that glance was so compressed, so urgent, that it communicated itself as clearly as a sentence. Asterisk. Please, those eyes said. Asterisk. Please help me. Asterisk. Ethan stood up. He wasn't entirely sure what he intended to do until he was already doing it. Hey, honey. His voice came out steadier than he expected. Sorry I'm late. The traffic on Mercer was brutal. He crossed the waiting room in 7 steps and stopped beside Victoria, close enough to be plausible. He could feel the tension radiating off her like heat. Victoria Hale had the kind of intelligence that processed situations very quickly. He saw it happen in real time, the fraction of a second it took her to integrate what he'd done, understand the shape of what he was offering, and make a decision. Then she turned to him, and her whole body changed. The rigidity softened by degrees. She reached out and took his hand, and her grip was firm and slightly too tight. And he let her have that. You made it, she said. And then, turning back to Margaret. Margaret. I don't think you've met my husband. This is Ethan. Margaret Lawson looked at him with the careful attention of someone recalibrating. Ethan met her gaze. He had spent his career dealing with customers who didn't believe the estimate they'd just been given. Customers who suspected they were being overcharged. Customers who came in looking for a fight. He knew how to hold eye contact without aggression and without apology, and he did that now. "Ethan," Margaret repeated, as though testing the weight of the word. "Nice to meet you," he said. He didn't offer his last name. It felt safer not to. "I wasn't aware Victoria had married." The smile again, thinner this time. "She keeps that very close to the chest." "We both do," Ethan said. He shrugged, the uncomplicated shrug of a man who genuinely doesn't care much what other people think, and was gratified to see the faintest acknowledgement cross Victoria's face. He was playing himself, mostly. That was the only way any of this was going to work. Margaret absorbed this. Her gaze moved between the two of them, assembling a picture, looking for the seams. "I had no idea," she said finally. "Congratulations." The word was delivered without any warmth whatsoever. "When did this happen?" "Last fall," Victoria said. "We wanted to keep it quiet until things settled down at the company." "How thoughtful." Margaret's eyes went to Ethan one more time, a final measurement. Then she glanced at her watch. "I should get back to the 3rd floor. I'll see you Thursday." "Victoria," another pause, the kind designed to land. "I do hope today's appointment was nothing serious." "Completely routine," Victoria said. Margaret walked back to the elevators. Neither of them moved until the doors had closed. Then Victoria Hale's hand tightened in his, and she exhaled one long, shuddering breath that seemed to compress weeks of held tension into a single release. And she said very quietly, "Thank you. You just saved me." Ethan looked down at their joined hands. Her knuckles were white. "You want to sit down?" he said. "Yes," she admitted. "I do." They sat across from each other in the corner of the waiting room, the one farthest from the nurse's station, with the rain-blurred window at Victoria's back and the overhead light casting both of them in the same flat, ungenerous fluorescence. She told him quickly, the way people tell things they need to get out before they lose the nerve. She had come in 3 weeks ago for what she'd described to her assistant as a specialist consultation. The tests had taken time. Today she had received the results. Stage 2 adenocarcinoma. Primary tumor in the upper lobe of the left lung. No detected lymph node involvement. No visible metastasis on the imaging. The oncologist had used the phrase "times highly treatable" and had followed it with a treatment protocol that involved 6 weeks of targeted therapy and a surgical consult. She had sat in the consultation room and listened to all of it very carefully. And then she had walked back out through the door, and Margaret Lawson had been standing in the waiting room like a punishment for something. Ethan listened without interrupting. "I've been managing the company for 7 years," Victoria said. Her voice was flat now, stripped of the professional veneer. "I built the Pacific Northwest Division from $40 million to nearly $400 million in assets under management. The board trusted me because I delivered results and because I never, in 7 years, gave them a single reason to doubt my capacity to lead." She looked at her hands. The tremor had faded, but the memory of it was still there in the careful stillness she was imposing on them. "Margaret Lawson has been trying to displace me for 2 of those 7 years. She doesn't have enough votes on the board to move directly against me, but she has enough to raise a question, and if she raises the right question at the wrong moment," Victoria stopped. "The wrong moment being 3 days from now," Ethan said. She looked at him. "You picked that up. You both mentioned the Harrington proposal." She knew the timeline. He leaned back in the chair. "What happens in 3 days? There's a vote to approve a merger. $2.3 billion. I've been negotiating it for 14 months. If the vote passes, it's the most significant deal this company has made in a decade, and no board on earth removes the CEO who closed it." A breath. "If Margaret can introduce doubt about my health, about my ability to see the next 12 months through, she has enough allies on the board to table the vote. And if the vote gets tabled, the Harrington window closes." and I lose the deal and probably the position within 6 months. And she knows you were in the oncology wing. She knows. She saw the signage. She saw me." Victoria looked out the rain-blurred window. "I can treat the cancer. The oncologist is confident about the prognosis, but I cannot treat it and fight the board at the same time if they start asking questions about my health that I'm not ready to answer publicly." The room was quiet for a moment. Somewhere down the corridor, a cartwheel squeaked against the linoleum. "You need 3 days," Ethan said. "I need 3 days." He studied her. The composed exterior, the precise language, the way she'd deployed the story efficiently without asking for pity. And, underneath all of it, the same thing he'd seen in her eyes across the waiting room. The specific exhaustion of someone fighting on too many fronts at once, with no one standing beside them. "There's a dinner tomorrow evening," she said. "Industry people. People who report back to the board informally. And a smaller breakfast meeting Thursday morning before the vote." She met his eyes. "If you were seen with me at both, if the story about the marriage held, it changes the narrative. Instead of a sick CEO trying to hold on, I'm a private person who simply didn't publicize her personal life. It shifts the story." Ethan was quiet. "I know what I'm asking," she said. "I'm a stranger. This is a significant thing to ask of a stranger." He thought about the clock on the wall. He thought about Mia's hands on his shirt buttons that morning, her face pulled into exaggerated concentration. "I'm still waiting on my own results," he said. She hadn't known that. He watched her register it. "I'm sorry," she said, and he could hear that she meant it. He told her what he knew, which wasn't much yet. The shadow on the ultrasound. He didn't dramatize it, because he never dramatized anything. And she listened the way he'd listened to her attentively, without reflexive reassurances. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What would you need?" she asked. "If it's serious, a plan for Mia." He said it simply because he'd been thinking it for 11 days and there was no delicate way to frame it. "She's 7. She's got me, and she's got Claire's mother in Spokane who's in her 70s and not well herself. If I'm not in a position to raise her, I need to know she's protected. Financially and legally." He paused. "I've been meaning to get to an estate attorney for 2 years, and I keep not doing it because he stopped. Because doing it makes it real. Because as long as the paperwork doesn't exist, neither does the possibility. I keep not doing it." Victoria nodded slowly. "I can have my legal team put together a comprehensive protection framework. A trust, a guardianship designation, an education fund. The kind of structure that means she never has to worry about money regardless of what happens." She held his gaze. "If you help me get through Thursday, and if my results come back clean, the legal work stands regardless?" He looked at her for a long moment. The overhead light was unkind to both of them, he thought. They both looked tired and a little worn down and entirely real, which he supposed was appropriate given the circumstances. "I'll need a cover story that doesn't have holes in it," he said. "I've already been thinking about that." She reached for the leather portfolio on the chair beside her. He realized she'd brought it to the hospital, that she'd had meetings today, even while waiting for this result, or had intended to, or was simply the kind of person who could not stop moving. The simpler the better. Something I can maintain without detailed fabrication. They spent 40 minutes building it. Her car had broken down 8 months ago, a genuine occurrence, she said. She drove a Tesla and had gotten a flat on I-5 and had called for roadside assistance. Ethan had been the mechanic dispatched. He'd fixed the tire. She'd been late for a meeting and not quite as gracious as she should have been. And then she'd felt guilty about it and had returned to the shop the following week to apologize in person. And that turned into what? Ethan said. Coffee. Which turned into dinner. Which turned into... She paused. What would be believable? Given who you are and who I'm supposed to be. Someone who made you less miserable than your job was making you, Ethan said. He said it without thinking, and then heard how it sounded and felt the need to clarify. "I mean, no," Victoria said quietly. "That's exactly right. That's precisely the thing someone like Margaret would find most disarming, because she would expect me to have married someone strategic, and a mechanic who made me feel like a human being instead of a function is the least strategic possible choice." A small, complicated expression crossed her face. We married in October. City Hall. Small dinner after. We kept it quiet. "Why no ring?" he said. She glanced at her left hand. "I had it sized. It hasn't come back yet from the jeweler." "That works." She wrote down the story in her precise handwriting, and he read it back, and they identified 2 places where it could be challenged and revised them. She gave him her personal cell number. He gave her his. The rain continued against the glass. When he stood to go, she stood too, and for a moment they were both just standing there in the terrible light of the waiting room, 2 people who had come in alone and were leaving with an arrangement that neither of them had anticipated. "I'll pick you up tomorrow at 6, she said. "The dinner is at 7. I'll need an address." She wrote it on the back of one of her business cards and handed it to him. He looked at it. * Victoria Hale, Chief Executive Officer, Meridian Property Group. He put it in his shirt pocket. "Thank you, Ethan," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "See how tomorrow goes." The restaurant was called Dockside, and it occupied a glass-fronted space on the waterfront that managed the unusual architectural feat of making its diners feel both enclosed and exposed simultaneously. Every table had a view of the Elliott Bay, which on that Tuesday evening was the color of beaten silver under a clearing sky. The city was behaving, just barely, like spring. Ethan had borrowed a jacket from his brother's closet navy wool, slightly too broad in the shoulders, and had driven himself to Meridian Property Group's downtown office because Victoria had suggested it might look more natural that way. He stood at the lobby's security desk, gave his name, and rode the elevator to the 22nd floor, where she was waiting. She looked different here. In the hospital, the suit had been armor against a frightening situation. Here, it was native dress she belonged to, this environment of polished concrete and floor-to-ceiling glass and the soft hum of expensive ventilation systems. Her hair was down. She wore a single, thin necklace. She'd put on her professional face, which he was beginning to understand was not quite the same as her real one. "You look fine," she said, evaluating his jacket with a single glance. "Don't worry about it." "I wasn't worried," he said, which was partially true. The dinner had 16 people. Industry people, as she'd said, investors, developers, a couple of city council members who moved in commercial real estate circles, 2 journalists who weren't there professionally but would remember what they saw. Ethan ate his salmon and listened more than he spoke, which turned out to be the correct approach because the conversations around him were almost entirely about projects and negotiations and zoning decisions he had no context for, and silence is always more convincing than poorly informed commentary. What he did know was machinery, and social dynamics at a table like this had their own mechanical logic. He could read the load-bearing relationships, who was deferring to whom, where the real decisions were being made, which of the smiling conversations concealed active hostility. He watched Victoria work the room with a fluency that was genuinely impressive, tracking 4 different conversations simultaneously, adjusting her register and her vocabulary depending on who she was speaking to, never appearing to do any of it on purpose. He also noticed the 3 times she was asked some variant of the question Margaret Lawson had raised in the hospital about pressure, about health, about whether she was managing the pace. Margaret herself was not present at the dinner, but her question was dispersed through the social fabric like a contamination. Each time it came up, Ethan leaned slightly toward Victoria, not possessively, just adjacently, the way a person does when they're comfortable rather than performing comfort. Once he caught the subtle shift in the asker's expression that meant they'd registered it and recalibrated. That was the thing about a lie built on real behavior, he thought. It was a lot easier to maintain. Near the end of the evening, a developer named Preston Gale, large-floored, the kind of man who filled a room by volume rather than presence, cornered Ethan near the drinks table. "So you're the mystery husband," Preston said. "Not hostile, exactly. Just testing." "Apparently," Ethan said. "What is it you do?" "I run a shop. Auto repair." Preston looked him over with the calibrated interest of a man trying to figure out what category to file him in. "And Victoria's all right," with a vague gesture at the room, at the world it represented. Ethan looked at him steadily. "She doesn't need my permission to be good at her job, and she doesn't need my confusion about it either." He let that sit for a moment. "She needs someone who's there when she gets home." "That's a different skill set." Preston blinked. Then he laughed, a genuine one, surprised out of him. "Fair enough," he said. "Fair enough." On the drive back, Victoria was quiet for most of the ride. Then she said, "Preston will tell people you're not what they expected. Is that bad?" "No." She looked out at the passing city. "It's better. Unexpected people are harder to construct a narrative around." A pause. "You were good tonight. I was quiet," he said. "That's usually enough." She turned to look at him briefly in the light of a passing street lamp. "No," she said. "It was more than that. You were there. There's a difference." The next evening, he brought Mia. He hadn't entirely planned to. He'd arranged for Linda to keep her. But Linda had a family situation come up late in the afternoon, and Victoria had said come anyway when he texted to explain, and so at 5:30 he was standing outside the Meridian building again, this time with a 7-year-old holding his hand and wearing her rain boots with the frogs on them because she'd refused to change them after school. "Is she nice?" Mia asked in the elevator. "I think so," Ethan said. "Does she know about me?" Mia considered this. "Does she have kids? Does she have a cat?" "I don't know, Bug. I'm going to ask her." "Okay," Ethan said. Victoria was in a smaller conference room off the main office, a glass-walled space that looked out over the executive floor, surrounded by documents and a half-eaten sandwich on a paper plate. She looked up when they came in, and something shifted in her expression, not discomfort. Exactly, but the particular alertness of someone recalibrating for an unexpected variable. Mia walked directly up to her. Victoria looked at her for a moment. "No. I have a very large plant." Mia thought about this. "Is it a nice plant?" "I think it's trying its best," Victoria said. Mia accepted this and climbed into the chair across from Victoria and began examining the documents on the table with frank curiosity. "Don't touch those," Ethan said. "I'm not touching. I'm looking." Victoria slid one of the less sensitive documents across the table toward Mia. "This one you can look at," she said. "It's a map of buildings." Mia studied it with the serious focus she applied to most things. "Is that your buildings?" "Some of them." "That's a lot of buildings." "It is. My dad fixes cars," Mia offered. "He has the shop. He has a big sign." "I know," Victoria said. "He's very good at it." Mia looked up at her with the direct and slightly unnerving gaze of a child who hasn't learned yet that eye contact can be too much. "Are you sick?" she asked. The room was briefly very quiet. "I'm getting better," Victoria said. And the thing that struck Ethan, standing in the doorway of the conference room, was the steadiness of her voice when she said it. Not performed steadiness, the real kind. The kind that comes from deciding to believe something. "Okay," Mia said, apparently satisfied, and returned to the map. Victoria looked at Ethan across his daughter's head, and for a moment the boardroom and the diagnosis and the merger and all of it fell away, and she was just a tired person looking at another tired person across a room, and he thought, asterisk, she's alone in this. She has been for a long time. Asterisk. Later, after Mia had fallen asleep on the small couch in Victoria's office with her frog boots still on, Victoria spread the legal documents across the conference table and walked him through them. The trust structure. The education fund parameters. The guardianship framework, 3 possible guardians, ranked in order of Mia's relationship with them and their capacity to provide for her. With legal contact information and a letter explaining the provisions, he read through it carefully. She'd had her legal team produce a 40-page document in under 36 hours. He thought about how much that must have cost and then decided not to think about it. "This is comprehensive," he said. "I had a good team." She paused. "And I know what it is to not have things arranged, to have things just unfinished and dangerous." She didn't say anything more about it, and he didn't ask. He signed where she indicated. She signed the copies. He put one set in the inside pocket of his jacket. Mia made a small sound in her sleep. They both looked at her the way she was curled with her chin tucked, one boot sliding slightly off her heel. Outside the window, Seattle was doing its quiet, nighttime thing. The lights of the waterfront and the dark mass of the Sound beyond, and the first of the spring stars just visible through a break in the cloud cover. The office was warm. The legal documents sat in a neat stack between them. "She looks like you around the eyes," Victoria said. "Claire, mostly," Ethan said. "But yes, a little." They sat with that for a while. Thursday arrived the way consequential days always do, with no particular fanfare, in the middle of ordinary life. Ethan was at the shop by 7. He had 2 appointments before 10 and a transmission job that needed to be finished by noon. His phone was in his shirt pocket, and every time it vibrated he felt the specific dread of a man waiting on 2 different phone calls from 2 different doctors. The call from Dr. Whitfield's office came at 9:47. The nurse asked if he could come in at 11. He said he could. He handed the transmission job to his shop assistant, washed his hands, changed his shirt in the back office. He drove to the medical clinic with the radio off. Dr. Whitfield was a man in his late 50s with a measured quality to everything he said. A man who had delivered bad news often enough that he'd learned the specific weight of every word and chose them accordingly. He had Ethan's file open on his desk when Ethan came in. He looked up over his reading glasses. "Well," he said. The pathology came back. Ethan held still. "It's not a malignancy." Dr. Whitfield's voice was careful and clear. "What we're looking at is autoimmune hepatitis. That sounds alarming. But it's important to understand that this is a manageable, treatable condition with good long-term outcomes in cases like yours." He took off his reading glasses. "You're not in danger of losing your liver. You're not looking at cancer. With the right medication and monitoring, most people with this diagnosis live completely normal lives." Ethan heard the words. He heard all of them. And then, for a while, he couldn't quite organize a response, because the thing he'd been holding at arm's length for 11 days, the solid shape of his fear, the scenario he'd built and rebuilt in the dark hours at 3 in the morning, simply stopped being real, and in the space where it had been, there was something so large and formless that it filled his chest and pressed upward, and came out as a sound that surprised him. Dr. Whitfield handed him a box of tissues and let him sit there until the wave passed. "Take your time," the doctor said. Ethan took his time. When he left the clinic, he stood on the sidewalk in the thin April sunshine for a moment and texted his brother a single sentence. Asterisk, results came back. "I'm fine." Then he stood there a while longer, watching the ordinary street do its ordinary things, and felt the almost unbearable lightness of an ordinary afternoon that had just been given back to him. Then he thought about Victoria, who was in a boardroom right now, and who did not have the same news. The Meridian Property Group's executive boardroom occupied a corner of the 22nd floor and was designed to signal authority at every level. The long table of dark walnut, the 12 high-backed chairs, the absence of windows on 2 walls to keep the focus internal, the sound system that could amplify a whisper to fill the room. Victoria arrived 8 minutes early, which was intentional. She had spent the past 3 days in the particular discipline of compartmentalization, keeping the cancer in one room of her mind, the merger in another, the arrangement with Ethan in a third, and moving between them with the careful attention of someone managing a building during a structural inspection. She was tired in a way that went below muscle and bone, but she had been tired before, and she knew that tired did not mean incapable. The 9 board members filed in over the following 6 minutes. Margaret Lawson arrived last, which was also intentional, and sat directly across from Victoria. The first 40 minutes were procedural financial reviews, due diligence summaries, the legal team's final risk assessment of the Harrington acquisition. Victoria had written the overview herself and delivered it without notes, because she had written it herself and had been living with every number for 14 months, and this was something she knew she could do. Then came the questions. Most were genuine board members stress-testing the assumptions, probing the financing structure, which was their job and which she answered precisely. But Margaret had 3 questions that weren't about the deal at all, which everyone at the table understood even if no one said it directly. They were about capacity, about continuity, about the company's stability over the next 12 to 18 months. The Harrington integration is going to require intensive executive bandwidth for the better part of 2 years, Margaret said, her voice reasonable and concerned in a way that made the concern feel like a blade. I think the board deserves transparency about your plans for that period, your personal situation, your availability, whether there are factors we should be aware of that might affect your ability to give this the full commitment it requires. Victoria looked at her across the length of the dark walnut table. She had thought about this moment. She had prepared for it several different ways. She had a version that was deflecting, and a version that was aggressive, and a version that was exhausted and honest. And she had cycled through all of them in the past 2 days and had decided that none of them were quite right. What she said instead was this: I have been negotiating this deal for 14 months. I know its structure better than anyone in this room. I know its risks, and I know its upside, and I know exactly what the integration requires because I designed the integration plan. I will be here for it. A pause. I have also, in those 14 months, gotten married. But I will tell you this. I have more reason than I have ever had in my professional life to make the next 2 years count. I intend to. She let that sit. Then she called the vote. It passed 7-2. The Harrington merger was approved. Victoria Hale held her seat. She walked out of the boardroom at 2 in the afternoon and took the elevator to the lobby and stood in the glass-fronted entrance of the building looking out at 3rd Avenue. At the ordinary afternoon moving past and called Ethan. He answered on the 2nd ring. It passed, she said. A brief silence. Then, good. Are you? She stopped. Her voice had done something unexpected, and she needed a moment to bring it back. Did you? I'm fine, he said. It's not cancer. It's treatable. She stood in the lobby of the building she'd spent 7 years building and pressed her free hand flat against the cold glass of the window and thought about that. About both of them, 3 days ago, in that waiting room, waiting for verdicts. About the specific gratuitousness of relief when it finally arrives. I'm at the hospital, she said. I have a scan appointment, a breath. I scheduled it for after the vote so I wouldn't be thinking about it during the boardroom. So I wouldn't be in 2 places at once. Are you alone? A brief silence. Stay there, he said. I'll come. She started to say he didn't have to, because she had spent years making sure she never needed anyone to come. She had designed her life around not needing people to come, but she'd sat in a waiting room 3 days ago and looked across the gray carpet at a stranger and felt the specific desperation of someone who had finally run out of ways to handle everything alone, and she'd asked him for help, and he'd stood up. Okay, she said instead. He was there in 22 minutes. She was sitting in the same waiting room, the same chairs, the same condensation on the same windows, the same overhead light, though the afternoon had shifted the quality of it from fluorescent pale to a warmer gold. He came through the door and sat down beside her and didn't say anything right away, which was the exactly correct thing to do. After a moment, she said, I'm scared. I know, he said. I wasn't scared in the boardroom. I haven't been scared in a professional setting since 2019. That's different. I know it's different. She looked at her hands. In there, I know what I can control. Out here, you can just be scared, he said. That's allowed. The nurse called her name 20 minutes later. She stood, and he stood too. And she said, You don't have to. And he said, Yeah, I do. And she let him walk with her to the door of the consultation corridor, where the rules about accompaniment required him to stop. She went in alone. She came out 35 minutes later with a scan envelope and a treatment plan, and the oncologist's measured, specific, encouraging words still assembling themselves into meaning inside her. The targeted therapy protocol. The 12-week first phase. The statistical prognosis, which was good. Which was genuinely, actually good. Ethan was where she'd left him. She sat down beside him and was quiet for a moment. Treatable, she said finally. The scan confirms the staging. The treatment protocol starts in 2 weeks. The prognosis is, she stopped. It's good. He said it's good. Okay, Ethan said. Okay, she agreed. Outside the 4th-floor windows, Seattle was doing what Seattle does in the slow last hours of an April afternoon, the light going amber and diffuse through the cloud cover, the sound gleaming faintly beyond the buildings, the drizzle just light enough to be ambient rather than intrusive. The city looked, from this angle, like a place where things could begin rather than only end. Ethan said, I'm going to pick up Mia at 4:30. You could, he stopped. If you wanted to, there's a place on Eastlake that does a breakfast for dinner thing on Thursdays. She thinks it's the best thing in the world. Victoria thought about the empty apartment she'd be going back to. The silence of a Tuesday night that had somehow become a Thursday, in which everything had changed and nothing had changed and everything had changed again. Breakfast for dinner, she said. Scrambled eggs, pancakes with the chocolate chips, bad orange juice. He paused. Linda makes her sit at the homework table first, so she'll have her backpack and she'll be annoyed about it. Fair warning. Victoria looked at him. This man she'd met 3 days ago in a waiting room. This man who had stood up because she'd asked him to with her eyes, who had built a story with her from the raw materials of nothing and made it hold, who had sat quietly in a boardroom dinner and redirected a conversation about her competence with 8 words and a shrug, who had let his daughter fall asleep on her office couch with her frog boots on, who had come to the hospital in 22 minutes without being asked twice. I'd like that, she said. The drizzle against the window was barely audible. Barely there. The kind of rain that you stop noticing after a while, that becomes indistinguishable from the air itself. Outside, the amber light was doing something complicated with the surface of the sound. Ethan was looking at her with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a person who means what he says and doesn't say anything he doesn't mean. She thought about the last 3 days, about waiting rooms and boardrooms and the particular weight of things you carry alone for so long they stop feeling like a weight and start feeling like your own skeleton. About the moment you ask for help and someone simply stands up. She thought about Mia's voice asking, "Asterisk, are you sick?" And her own answer, which had surprised her with its truth. Asterisk, I'm getting better. Asterisk, not past tense, present continuous, active and ongoing and real. Okay, she said, for the 3rd time that afternoon. And this time it meant something different. Outside, the spring rain continued soft against the hospital glass, soft against the city, soft against the windshields of the cars moving along the wet avenues, and the ferry cutting its patient line across the sound. The kind of rain that fills the air without weighing anything down. The kind of rain that makes everything look freshly made. Mia would be annoyed about the homework. The orange juice would be bad. Ethan would drive with the radio on low and not say much because he didn't say much, and Victoria would sit in the passenger seat of his truck with the legal documents for her daughter's future in the glove compartment and an oncology treatment plan in her bag and 7 years of the company she'd built still. standing and the vote she'd needed passed and the diagnosis. She'd feared, confirmed, and manageable and real. 3 days ago, they had both been alone in a waiting room. That was still true, in a way. Some things you carry alone. Some fears don't translate. Some rooms you walk into by yourself no matter who's standing outside the door. But there is a difference. Ethan had learned 3 years ago at the end of a different kind of waiting, between carrying something alone and carrying it times without anyone knowing you're carrying it at all. The weight is the same. The loneliness is not. He would pick her up at the entrance in 10 minutes. She would climb into his truck, and they would drive through the amber Seattle afternoon to collect a 7-year-old who was annoyed about her homework, but would immediately forgive everything the moment pancakes were mentioned, and the rain would be soft against the windshield, and none of it would be cold.